Two warriors fall from a sky that was never theirs to fall from. The Riverlands burn under banners that don't know their names. Stark gray, Lannister crimson, Tully blue. And in the middle of it, a crater. Still smoking. Still glowing. A boy climbs out first. Spiky black hair, an orange gi torn at the shoulder, grinning like he just won something. Behind him, shorter, sharper, furious. A prince who was never asked if he wanted to be here. Westeros has White Walkers. It has dragons. It has red priests who talk to fire. None of that prepared it for this. This is Multiverse Saiyan. And this is what if Goku and Vegeta landed in Game of Thrones. A war of 5 kings is about to become a war it was never built to survive. Houses that have stood for centuries are about to learn what it means to be outmatched. And somewhere out there, in the true dark beyond the wall, something old is about to feel 2 power levels it has never once had to account for. Written for you by James Phillip, who wants to know what you want to see next. Drop your next what if in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe, smash that bell, and let's find out what happens when Saiyan pride meets Westerosi steel. The Riverlands don't scream. That's the thing Wendell Mudd would remember after, when men at the fire asked him to tell it again. The land didn't scream, didn't shake the way you'd expect a mountain falling to shake it. It just went white, then quiet. Then there was a sound like the sky tearing a strip off itself, and by the time Wendell's horse had bolted out from under him and dumped him face first into a hedge of gorse, the light was already fading back down into an ordinary afternoon. He lay there a long moment, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue, listening to his horse crash away through the brush toward the Tully camp a mile east. Overhead, the clouds were still curling wrong, spiraling outward from a point like water draining backward, and that, more than the light, more than the sound, was what put the fear in him. Weather didn't do that. Weather didn't flinch. He should have run after the horse. He was 19, a hunter's son from a nothing village on the Red Fork, and he had exactly one skill that made him useful to Lord Tully's war effort. He could move through brush without being heard, and he could see things other men missed. So instead of running, he did what his father had beaten into him since he was 6 years old holding his first bow. He got low, and he looked. The crater sat in what had been, that morning, a wheat field belonging to a smallholder named Tomas Ashwood, 2 miles south of the Stark camp on the Red Fork. It was easily 40 feet across. The earth at its lip fused to something like black glass, wisps of smoke still lifting off it in threads that didn't waver in the wind, as if the wind itself were giving the place a wide berth. Wendell had seen what dragonfire did to stone, once as a boy, when a hedge knight told stories of Aegon's conquest. This looked like that, except there hadn't been a dragon. There hadn't been anything in the sky at all, until the sky had torn. Then he heard the voice, and the voice was the second thing that told him this was going to be a very bad day to be the man who found it first. Okay, that one hurt a little, the voice said, bright and untroubled, from somewhere down inside the smoking crater. You all right, Vegeta? All right? A second voice, colder, sharper, edged with something that in Wendell's experience only ever meant a man about to hit someone. We have been thrown out of 3 consecutive dimensions in as many hours, Kakarot, and you ask if I am all right. I mean, you're not bleeding or anything. I am not bleeding, I am furious. There is a difference. Wendell Mudd, who had exactly one skill and had just used it, did the only sensible thing left to him. He backed out of the gorse on his elbows, found his feet, and ran for the Tully camp like every hound of the 7 hells was on his heels. Because whatever was arguing in that crater, it was arguing in the common tongue, and that was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. They found the camp already stirring when he burst into it. Men grabbing spears half-dressed, horses screaming at their pickets, and above the tree line to the south, still, that same slow, unnatural curl of cloud. The tremor had reached them too. Half of Robb Stark's northern host was on its feet, with steel in hand, before Wendell had even gotten a full sentence out to the first man he grabbed. Something fell, he gasped, to a Tully man-at-arms who had him by the collar before he registered it wasn't a Lannister scout. Southfield, Ashwood's wheat. There's a hole in the ground you could bury a haul in, and there's men in it, talking, in the common tongue. Word moved through a war camp faster than fire through dry gorse, and within a quarter hour Wendell found himself half-dragged, half-escorted to the command tent, repeating himself to Robb Stark, king in the north, and to Robb's uncle by marriage, Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, gray-bearded and gray-eyed and entirely unmoved by a boy's babbling about holes in the ground, until the boy mentioned that the ground had glowed white before it fell quiet. "Sit him," Robb said, and someone did, and pressed a skin of watered wine into Wendell's shaking hands. Robb was young, younger than Wendell had expected a king to look, up close, auburn hair damp with sweat from being roused out of a war council, gray eyes doing that thing Wendell had heard men say Stark eyes did, weighing you like a debt to be settled. Start from when you saw the light. Wendell told it straight, the way his father had taught him to report a kill or a track. What he'd seen, in order, nothing added, nothing left out because it embarrassed him. The tearing sky, the crater, the glass-black earth, the voices. Catelyn Stark, standing at her son's shoulder with her arms folded into her cloak against the evening chill, spoke first when he'd finished. "Sorcery," she said, flat, not a question. "Or dragons." "No dragons in 100 years, my lady," Sir Brynden said. "Not since the last one died screaming under King's Landing. And no maesters ever taught me sorcery sounds like two men bickering like fishwives." "He said one called the other by name," Robb said, turning back to Wendell. "You're certain of the words?" "Aye, your grace. One called himself. The other called him Kakarot, I think. Or maybe that was a jest between them. I couldn't rightly tell. And the second one, the sharp one, he called himself Vegeta. Plain as that. Vegeta. Nobody in the tent had ever heard either name in their life. That, more than the crater, more than the tremor that had rattled cookpots 3 miles up the Red Fork, was what decided it. A monster you could name from the old stories. You knew how to fight. A monster with no name in any book a maester had ever written. That was a different animal entirely. "We go look," Robb said, and when his mother started to object, he cut her off gently but without give. Not blind, and not alone. 50 riders, the Blackfish at the front, and I want Grey Wind with us. His jaw set in that particular way Catelyn recognized from his father. Whatever fell out of the sky onto my bannerman's land, I mean to see it with my own eyes before I decide whether it's an enemy, a weapon, or a corpse worth burying. The crater looked worse in the dying light than Wendell had described it. The smoke had thinned, but the glassed rim still held a residual heat you could feel from 10 yards off, and the wheat for 30 feet in every direction had been flattened outward in a perfect ring. Stalks laid down like a scythe the size of a giant had swept through once. Grey Wind paced the tree line, hackles up, refusing to come closer than 100 paces, which told Robb more than any scout's report could have. They heard the two strangers before they saw them, still arguing, unmistakably, the sharp-voiced one's tone climbing toward something genuinely dangerous. "I am telling you, the coordinates were correct, Kakarot. It is the machine that, or maybe it's just, one of those things." Goku's voice, easy as a man discussing the weather, drifted up out of the crater's lip a moment before he did, climbing the glassed slope one-handed, orange gi torn, grinning at the 50 mounted riders now ringing the wheat field with steel drawn and nerves stretched wire-taut. "Oh, hey!" He raised a hand and waved, genuinely delighted, as if he'd stumbled into a village fair rather than a company of northern cavalry. "Sorry about your field. We didn't exactly pick the landing spot." 50 spears dropped to level. 50 horses shifted uneasy under riders who'd faced Lannister cavalry without flinching, and now found their mounts fighting the bit at the sight of one grinning stranger in torn orange cloth. Vegeta came up out of the crater a moment later, arms crossed, boots crunching on fused glass, and looked at the assembled riders with the flat, unimpressed contempt of a man surveying insects. "How quaint," he said. "Spears." "Vegeta." Goku's voice held a warning, mild but real. "I am not going to start anything, Kakarot. I am simply observing." He didn't uncross his arms, though I note none of them have lowered theirs either. Robb Stark walked his horse forward 3 paces, close enough to be heard, not so close his men lost their angle, and Wendell pressed in among the riders, wishing very much he'd stayed a hunter's son and never learned to move quiet through brush, watched a king do the thing his father did, before deciding whether a stranger at the door was friend or threat. He looked, and he listened, and he didn't commit to anything yet. "You fell from the sky onto my bannerman's land," Robb said, voice pitched to carry, level, giving nothing away. "You speak the common tongue. You're dressed for no army or court I've ever seen fly a banner. I'd have you tell me plainly who you are and what you want here, before either of us decides the other's an enemy." Goku's grin didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, the easy warmth staying, but a weight settling in under it, the look of a man who'd been asked that question by 100 kings and warlords across 100 worlds, and had learned, eventually, what answer actually mattered. "Name's Goku," he said. "This is Vegeta. We're not looking for a fight, though." He glanced sideways, and something like genuine curiosity crossed his face. "Not against one either, if it comes to that. Mostly we just want to figure out where we are, and maybe eat something. We used a lot of energy getting here." "Where you are," Sir Brendan cut in, walking his horse up alongside Robb's, voice gravel dry, "is the Riverlands, in the middle of a war, on land loyal to House Tully and House Stark both. Which side of that war you fall on, stranger, is the only question that matters to 50 men with spears pointed at your chest." Vegeta's laugh was short, sharp, and entirely without warmth. "You imagine your spears are the reason we haven't simply—" "Vegeta," Goku said it again, quieter this time, and something in it, not fear, nothing close to fear, but a kind of tired, patient authority, made the shorter man's jaw tighten and his mouth shut. It was the first thing the Stark riders saw that told them these two strangers, whatever else they were, had a hierarchy between them, and that it wasn't fixed by strength alone. "We're not with anybody's war," Goku went on, easy again, turning back to Robb. "We don't even know whose war it is. We just landed here. Could have been anywhere. This time it was here." He shrugged, an oddly boyish gesture from a man who'd just climbed unhurt out of a 40-foot smoking crater. "If you've got somewhere safe we could talk this through without pointy things aimed at us, I'm happy to explain everything I understand about it. Which, I'll be honest, isn't much." It was, Caitlin would say later when Robb recounted it to her, precisely the kind of answer that told you nothing and everything at once. No threats, no boasts. An admission of ignorance too calm to be a lie, and underneath all of it, utterly, unshakably unafraid of 50 spears that would have made a hardened sellsword sweat. Robb held the stranger's eyes a long moment. Then, slowly, he raised one hand, and 50 spear points lifted with it, not sheathed, not lowered fully, but no longer leveled at 2 men's chests. "You'll ride with us under watch," Robb said. "Not chains. I've no cause yet to call you enemies, and I'll not treat guests as prisoners on a hunch. But you'll answer my mother and my uncle's questions plainly, and if I find you've lied to me, watch or no watch won't save you." His gray eyes flicked once to Vegeta, cool and measuring. "And your friend there minds his tone around my men, or I'll let them find out for themselves whether spears matter." For one long, taut second, nobody in that field breathed. Then Vegeta's mouth curled, not quite a smile, something colder and more amused than that, and he inclined his head a bare inch, the smallest gesture of respect Wendell Mudd would ever see him give a Westerosi lord. "A king with a spine," he said. "How refreshing. Very well, boy king. Lead on." Goku just grinned wider, fell into step beside the horses without any escort needing to touch him, and glanced up once at the strange, slow-healing scar the tremor had torn across the evening sky. "So," he said, conversationally, to no one in particular, "does anybody around here know if there's, like, a strong guy? Because wherever we land, there's usually a strong guy." Nobody answered him. But 300 miles north and east, in the true dark beyond a wall of ice 800 feet high, something that had slept in cold and silence since before any house in Westeros had raised its first banner turned its attention, for the first time in centuries, toward a disturbance in the world it did not recognize and did not like. The Stark Tully war camp smelled like wet leather and wood smoke, and the particular sourness of too many men and horses packed too close for too long, and Goku breathed it in like a man arriving somewhere new and interesting, rather than a prisoner under watch. Vegeta breathed it in like a man cataloging threats. They were given a tent near the center of camp, not the command tent, but close enough to it that the message was clear: watched, not dismissed. 24 guards ringed it in shifts. Vegeta had counted them within the first 10 minutes, along with the sight lines, the gaps in the picket line, and the fact that not one man among them could have stopped him if he decided to leave. He said none of this aloud. He simply noted it, the way he noted everything, and settled onto the offered cot with his arms crossed and his eyes half-lidded, radiating the specific contempt of a prince waiting out an insult he'd decided wasn't worth killing anyone over yet. "You could try being nicer to them," Goku said, sprawled on the ground rather than the cot, already working through a bowl of the camp stew like it was the finest meal he'd had in weeks. "They're not bad, just scared. Scared people do dumb stuff sometimes. I am aware of what scared people do, Kakarot. I have killed a great many of them." Vegeta didn't open his eyes. "Being nice has never once been useful to me. It's gotten me out of a lot more trouble than being mean has. That is because you have the presence of an idiot child, and people mistake it for harmlessness. It will not work on everyone." It worked, as it happened, on Robb Stark for exactly as long as it took Catelyn to walk into the tent flanked by Sir Brynden and a Maester Goku hadn't met yet. Gray-robed, chain heavy at his throat, carrying a thick ledger and the pinched, hungry look of a man who'd rather be taking notes on a miracle than sleeping. Introductions went around. The Maester's name was Vyman, sworn to Riverrun, and he had clearly drawn the short straw of go find out what fell out of the sky, and intended to make the most of it. "You said you fell," Vyman began, quill already out. "From where?" "Honestly," Goku scratched the back of his head. "Not totally sure this time. We were fighting somewhere else, and then we weren't, and then we were here. It happens. Different worlds sometimes. I've landed in some pretty weird spots before." "Different worlds," Vyman repeated, and Wendell Mudd, standing at the tent flap because nobody had told him to leave and he was too curious to volunteer, watched the Maester's pen still entirely. "You're saying you're not from Essos, not from anywhere across the narrow sea. You're saying you fell from a different reality entirely." "That's the general idea, yeah." Catelyn's face didn't change, but her hand found the back of a camp chair and gripped it. "And you expect us to simply accept that?" "I don't expect anything," Goku said, and something in his tone shifted. Not defensive, just honest, the same weight Robb had caught in the field. "I've learned people believe what they see, mostly, not what you tell them. So ask me what you want to see and I'll show you, if it helps." He glanced sideways at Vegeta. "As long as nobody flinches and starts something over it." "I have made no promises regarding flinching," Vegeta said. Sir Brynden, who had spent 40 years reading liars across a negotiating table and had developed a bone-deep instinct for the smell of one, studied Goku a long moment before he spoke. "Show us something small," he said. Something that doesn't end with my king's tent on fire. Goku set down the stew bowl, considered, and then simply lifted. No crouch, no run-up, no visible effort at all. One moment he sat cross-legged on the dirt floor of the tent, and the next he hung 18 inches above it, perfectly still, grinning slightly at the collective intake of breath from everyone but Vegeta. He held it a 3 count, then settled back down, as though he'd merely leaned back in a chair. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Wendell, at the tent flap, found he'd taken an involuntary step backward and hadn't noticed doing it. "That," Sir Brynden said eventually, voice carefully even, "is not something a maester's chain prepares a man for." "There's more," Goku said, not boasting, just stating a fact. "A lot more. I didn't want to start with anything that'd put the tent on fire, like you said." "How much more?" Robb asked, and his voice had gone very quiet. Vegeta answered before Goku could, uncrossing his arms for the first time since sitting down, and the shift in his posture alone made 2 of the guards at the flap tighten their grip on their spears. "Understand something, Boy King, because I will only explain this once, and I have no patience to repeat myself for the slower members of your court." His eyes swept the tent. Robb, Catelyn, Brynden, the Maester, all of them. "What you saw a moment ago is a parlor trick. A child's first lesson. If either of us fought at true strength inside this camp, there would be no camp left to speak of. No river, no field, very likely no kingdom, depending on how thoroughly Kakarot's idiot enthusiasm got the better of him." "Hey," Goku said, mildly wounded. "It is not an insult, it is an observation." Vegeta didn't look away from Robb. "You are accustomed, I imagine, to measuring threats in armies and dragons and men with swords. I am telling you plainly, so that no one in this tent makes the fatal error of testing it. Neither measurement applies to us. We did not come here to conquer your war, but if you make the mistake of thinking a spear or a stone wall is a meaningful obstacle to either of us, you will learn the difference the only way stubborn men ever do." The silence that followed had weight to it. Catelyn was the one who broke it, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular steel of a mother who had already buried enough fear to know how to set it aside and function through it. "Then why?" she said. "Haven't you simply taken what you want? If what you say is true, if a spear means nothing to you, what stops you walking out of this camp right now, or through it?" It was, Robb would think later, exactly the right question, and exactly the one he hadn't thought fast enough to ask himself. Goku answered it, and for once there was nothing easy in his voice at all. "Because that's not why we're here," he said. "I've had plenty of chances in plenty of places to just take what I want. Never once made me feel like I'd actually won anything. I like a good fight, I won't pretend I don't, but I don't want one with people who never asked for it, over nothing." He looked at Catelyn directly. "You've got a war going on that's not ours. We're not looking to make it worse. But if something bigger than your war comes knocking, and where we've been, something bigger usually does, we're not gonna just stand around and watch either. That's who we are. Take it or don't." Vegeta said nothing to contradict him. That, more than anything spoken aloud, was what convinced Sir Brynden Tully, a man who had outlived 3 kings' worth of court intrigue and trusted almost nothing anyone told him outright, that at least the essential shape of it was true. Word of what had fallen into the Riverlands did not stay contained to one war camp for longer than it took a raven to fly. By the second morning, Vyman's account, carefully hedged, heavily caveated, and utterly unbelievable on the page, had gone by Raven to Riverrun, and from Riverrun, inevitably, copied and passed along the chains of alliance and enmity that ran through every great house in the 7 kingdoms. It reached Winterfell. It reached, within the week, the black cells beneath the Red Keep, where a very different kind of interested party read it twice, set it down, and called for his birds. Lord Tywin Lannister did not believe in monsters. He believed in men who were harder to kill than most, and in the value of knowing exactly how hard before anyone else worked it out. When his letter reached the Riverlands camp 11 days later, carried under a peace banner, addressed with cold formal courtesy to King Robb Stark, in recognition of a matter of mutual interest that transcends our present hostilities, it did not ask for surrender or truce. It asked, plainly and without disguise, whether House Stark would be willing to permit a Lannister envoy to observe the strangers, in the interest of understanding, before it becomes necessary to act, precisely what manner of thing has entered the war on either side. Robb read it twice in the command tent, Catelyn and the Blackfish flanking him, and set it down with a short, humorless laugh. "He's not offering peace," Robb said. "He's asking if I've found a weapon he needs to worry about." "He's asking the right question," Sir Brynden said. "Whatever we decide to do with these two, my king, you can be certain Tywin Lannister has already decided what he'd do with them, if he had them instead of you." That night, in the tent, they no longer bothered watching quite so tightly. 24 guards had quietly become 8, once it became clear that guarding Goku and Vegeta served no purpose except making everyone feel marginally less powerless. Goku sat outside under a sky that had finally, 3 days on, stopped bearing that faint, unnatural scar where they'd torn through it, and ate a second dinner, while Vegeta stood a short distance off, arms crossed, staring north. "You've been doing that a lot," Goku said, mouth full. "Staring off that way. Something's wrong up there." Vegeta didn't turn. "I felt it the moment we landed, and dismissed it as noise from the crossing. I no longer think it's noise." Goku swallowed, set the bowl down, and came to stand beside him, following his gaze north past the tents and the pickets and the dark tree line toward something neither of them could see, and both of them, in their own ways, had learned across 100 worlds to recognize the shape of. "Cold," Goku said slowly. "It wasn't a question. Cold," Vegeta agreed. "And old. Older than anything on this side of that wall these people keep talking about like scripture." His jaw tightened, and for once there was no contempt in his voice at all, only the flat, focused calculation of a warrior who had just found something worth taking seriously. "Whatever it is, Kakarot, it noticed us the same moment I noticed it. I'd stake my pride on that. Behind them, unheard, unseen, the War of 5 Kings ground on exactly as it had before two strangers fell into a wheat field. Robb's bannermen still bled for the north. Tywin's ravens still flew. The Iron Chair in King's Landing still sat empty of anyone who deserved it. But something in the balance of that war had shifted the moment the sky tore open over the Riverlands, and it would keep shifting, quietly and then not quietly at all, as word spread south to Highgarden and Dorne, east to the Vale, and north, always, inevitably, north, to a wall that had stood 8,000 years against exactly the kind of thing that had just begun, for the first time in all those centuries, to pay attention back. Wendell Mudd, still assigned by nobody's order except his own stubborn curiosity to keep half an eye on the stranger's tent, watched the shorter one stare north into the dark for the better part of an hour, and decided, quietly, that whatever came of all this, he intended to remember every detail, because something told him the Maesters would be writing about this war for a very long time, and he did not intend to be a footnote in someone else's account of it. The Lannister envoy arrived on the 14th day, and Tywin Lannister, never a man to waste an asset on ceremony, had chosen his messenger with characteristic precision. Not a lord, not a knight who might let pride get the better of judgment. He sent Tyrion. Robb received him in the command tent with the particular wariness reserved for a Lannister who might be a trap wearing a dwarf's face. But Tyrion Lannister had crossed half the Riverlands under a peace banner with an escort small enough to make the point plainly. "I've come to look, not to fight." And he made no move toward guile the moment he was shown in. "I understand you have guests," Tyrion said, settling into the offered chair with the ease of a man who'd made peace long ago with being underestimated in rooms full of people twice his height. My father is extremely interested in guests who can, by all report, lift themselves off the ground without visible means, and threaten the collapse of kingdoms as a passing remark. I confess I share the interest, though for less avaricious reasons. Mostly I'm curious. It isn't often something genuinely new happens in this world, Your Grace. Most of what passes for wonder here is just old horror wearing a fresh coat of paint. You want to see them, Robb said. It wasn't a question either. I want to talk to them. There's a difference, and it's one my father tends to forget. Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked toward Catelyn, standing at her son's shoulder with the specific stillness she reserved for anyone wearing the Lannister name. I promise you, Lady Stark, I've come with no army hidden in my sleeve. I'm considerably too short to hide anything of consequence. He got his meeting. Goku, entirely unbothered by rank or reputation, greeted Tyrion with the same open friendliness he'd have shown a farmer or a king, and within a quarter hour the two of them were deep in a conversation that ranged, improbably, from the mechanics of flight to the political structure of a Seven Kingdoms Goku only half understood, and clearly found more confusing than any opponent he'd ever fought. Vegeta observed from a distance, arms crossed, offering nothing beyond a scowl, until Tyrion, with the particular fearlessness of a man who has spent his whole life being underestimated and has decided to stop caring what larger, angrier people think of him, turned the conversation directly on him. "You're the dangerous one," Tyrion said, without preamble. "Your friend is dangerous too, obviously, but he wears it like a farmer wears mud. You wear it like a crown you never asked for and resent every day of." Something flickered behind Vegeta's eyes. Not warmth, nothing so soft as that, but a kind of grudging recognition. "You're more perceptive than the rest of your kind I've met so far," he said. "Most of them look at me and see either a weapon to point or a threat to kill. It has been tediously long since anyone bothered to simply look. Occupational habit. Being underestimated your whole life teaches you to notice who else is being underestimated." Tyrion poured himself wine from a skin he'd brought, not waiting for permission, and Vegeta, despite himself, found he did not entirely dislike the man's nerve. "May I ask you something, Prince? I gather that's the correct address, from what your companion let slip. Why are you here? Not the metaphysics of falling through skies, I mean here, in this tent, tolerating a war camp full of men who couldn't kill you with 1,000 years and every sword in the Seven Kingdoms. What keeps you from simply leaving and finding somewhere less inconvenient to wait out whatever brought you?" It was, Vegeta reflected, an irritatingly good question, and he found himself answering it more honestly than he'd intended. "Because Kakarot won't leave," he said, "and I am, against every instinct I was raised with, disinclined to abandon him in a world this poorly equipped to survive whatever mistakes his good nature will inevitably lead him into." He said it like an insult. It didn't quite land as one. "And because," he added, after a pause, "there is something wrong to the north of here. Something old and cold, and it noticed us the moment we arrived. I have not yet decided whether that is a threat worth my attention, or merely an irritation, but I intend to find out before I leave this world, one way or another." Tyrion's easy half-smile faded by degrees as he processed that, mismatched eyes sharpening. "You felt something, north, beyond the wall. I don't know what your wall is. I know what I felt." "Gods," Tyrion said softly, and for the first time since he'd walked into the tent, something like genuine unease crossed his face. "You've been here a fortnight and you've already noticed what half the maesters in this kingdom have spent 40 years refusing to write down in anything but marginal notes and rumor." He drained his cup in one motion. "I need to speak to my father, and I strongly suspect, Prince, that whatever you felt is going to matter a great deal more than any war currently being fought south of it." Tywin Lannister's response came back with unusual speed for a man who prized deliberation above nearly everything else, and it was not the response Robb's counsel expected. No demand to hand over the strangers. no veiled threat. Instead, a proposal, delivered again under peace banner, again through Tyrion, a temporary and strictly limited truce, Stark and Lannister and Tully both, for the sole purpose of allowing what Tywin's letter dryly termed an assessment of the northern matter before any of us waste further men fighting each other over a throne that will mean nothing if the reports my brother has relayed prove accurate. It took 3 days of furious argument in the Stark command tent before Robb agreed to even consider it. Catelyn deeply suspicious of any Lannister olive branch, Sir Brynden pragmatically noting that a truce cost them nothing but time and gained them intelligence. Robb himself caught between a young king's pride and a young king's growing gnawing awareness that he had, quite by accident, stumbled into something larger than his father's murder and his crown combined. It was Goku, oddly, who tipped the argument, sitting cross-legged at the edge of the council with the easy manner of a man who had no stake in Westerosi politics and therefore saw the shape of the problem more clearly than anyone who did. "You're all arguing about who gets to be right," he said, not unkindly. "But nobody's asked the only question that actually matters, which is the thing up north bigger than your war or not? Because if it's bigger, and Vegeta thinks it is, and he's not usually wrong about that kind of thing, then it doesn't matter who wins your crown. You'll all lose it to something worse if nobody deals with the real problem first." Robb looked at him a long moment, then at his mother, then at the map spread across the table. The 7 kingdoms laid out in their old familiar divisions, Winterfell and King's Landing and Casterly Rock. None of it touching the true blank space at the top of the map where the map makers, centuries ago, had simply stopped drawing anything at all past a long unbroken line marked only the wall. "Send word to Lord Tywin," Robb said finally. "Tell him I'll meet him. Neutral ground, minimal escort, and the truce holds only as long as it takes to understand what we're actually facing." His jaw tightened, the same set Catelyn had seen in his father 100 times before a hard decision. "And send a raven to Winterfell. If something's stirring beyond the wall, my brothers need to know before anyone else does." The parley took place a week later on a stretch of neutral ground near the ruins of an old watchtower, a scene that would have been unthinkable a month prior. Tywin Lannister and Robb Stark, enemies locked in open war, standing 20 feet apart under separate banners with their honor guards bristling at each other across the gap, and between them, entirely unbothered by the historic weight of the moment, Goku and Vegeta. Tywin Lannister studied the 2 Saiyans with the flat, assessing patience of a man who had spent his life measuring threats and assets in the same breath, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, genuinely uncertain which category applied. "I'm told," he said, without preamble, addressing Goku directly, "that you demonstrated an ability to lift yourself from the ground unassisted. I'd like to see something more convincing before I stake resources on your account of what lies to the north." "Figured you might." Goku glanced at Robb, a silent question, and Robb, after a long beat, gave a single nod. What followed was not violence. It was, more than anything, a demonstration calibrated with surgical restraint. Goku rose slowly into the air until he hung perhaps 40 feet above the assembled honor guards, gold light kindling around him in a slow, controlled bloom, hair lifting and paling from black to gold, the ground beneath him cracking in a spiderweb pattern from pressure alone, though he hadn't moved a muscle beyond simply existing at that level of output. He held it 3 full seconds, long enough for every man on that field to feel it in his chest like a held breath before a thunderclap, and then let it fade, settling back to the ground as gently as a leaf. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Even Tywin Lannister, a man who did not startle, found his hand had drifted, unconsciously, toward the hilt of a sword that both of them understood would have done nothing at all had this gone differently. "That," Tywin said eventually, voice carefully even, "was restraint. I'd like to know how much of it." "A fraction," Vegeta said flatly. Before Goku could answer, arms crossed, unmoved by the display he'd watched dozens of times before. Enough to convince you without wasting the effort of convincing you twice. Ask your real question, Lord of Casterly Rock. You didn't ride out here to watch a light show. Tywin's eyes narrowed, calculating, and something almost like respect crossed his weathered face. Very well. My real question is this. Is what my son and I have heard whispered about. Dead men walking, blue-eyed things beyond the wall that the Night's Watch has spent a generation insisting are children's stories. Is it real? And can either of you sense it the way you claim to have sensed it from 100 leagues south? Vegeta's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness did. A warrior's focus settling over him like a second skin. It's real, he said. I don't know what it is yet. I know it's old, and I know it doesn't sleep as soundly as your maesters seem to believe it does. And I know, Lord Lannister, that whatever war you're fighting over that chair of swords in your capital will look very small indeed, very soon, if nobody in this field takes that seriously. The wind shifted, cold suddenly, though it was midday and the season hadn't yet turned, and for a moment every banner on that field, lion and direwolf and trout alike, snapped taut in a gust that came from due north, carrying with it, faint but unmistakable to anyone paying attention, the smell of ice on air that had no business being that cold this far south, this early in the year. Tywin Lannister looked north, once, toward a wall he had not personally laid eyes on in 30 years, and made the decision that would define the rest of the war more than any battle fought before it. The truce holds, he said, until we know precisely what we're dealing with. I'll not have House Lannister remembered as the men who kept fighting over a throne while the world ended around them. He turned back to Goku and Vegeta, and something calculating entered his voice even now. A man who never stopped weighing advantage, even in the face of the unknown. But understand this. Whatever debt this kingdom owes you for the warning, it does not extend to trust. I intend to have you watched, understood, and, if it comes to it, managed. Men like you are not comfortable to have wandering unaccounted for in a war. Vegeta's smile, when it came, held no warmth at all. You may try, he said. I'd almost welcome the diversion. Behind them, unnoticed by anyone still watching the parley, Wendell Mudd, who had talked his way into Robb's traveling party by sheer persistence and the simple fact that he'd been first to find the crater, stood at the edge of the field with his eyes fixed north, and felt, for reasons he couldn't have named, the particular dread of a man who has just watched 2 kingdoms worth of enemies agree on something, and understood, without needing to be told, exactly how bad the thing they'd agreed about must be. The Raven from Winterfell reached the wall 3 days after Robb's letter went out, and Jon Snow, sworn brother of the Night's Watch, not yet a year in black, still more boy than man by his own reckoning, was the one who carried it up to the Lord Commander's solar, because Ser Alliser Thorne had assigned him to Maester Aemon's errands out of the same low, grinding contempt he showed every task he handed a Stark bastard. He didn't know what the letter said. He found out an hour later, when Aemon, blind, ancient, unshaken by 90 years of watching the realm forget the true danger it was sworn to guard against, called him back into the solar and read it aloud in a voice gone suddenly, uncharacteristically taut. Your brother writes, Aemon said, that 2 strangers have fallen into the Riverlands possessed of power beyond anything recorded in any text he or his maester have access to, that they claim to have sensed something ancient and cold to the north, that Lord Tywin Lannister himself has called a truce on the strength of it. The old man set the letter down with hands that trembled only slightly. In 60 years at this wall, Jon Snow, I have read a great many ravens claiming wildlings stir, or wolves grow bold, or the cold runs deep this year. I have never once read a raven in which the hand of the king and a king in the north agreed to stop killing each other over what lies beyond it. You think it's true, Jon said. Whatever fell. I think, Aemon said, That something has been restless beyond that wall for longer than either of us has been alive, Jon Snow, and that restlessness does not choose convenient timing. I think two strangers falling from an impossible sky, and that same restlessness stirring at the same moment, is not the kind of coincidence a careful man dismisses. He turned his clouded eyes, uselessly but with a lifetime's habit, toward where he judged Jon to be standing. "Fetch Lord Commander Mormont. He'll want to hear this before the ravens go quiet with winter, and I fear, more than I have feared anything in 60 years, that they may go quiet soon." Lord Commander Jeor Mormont read the letter twice by candlelight, his great bear cloak pooled around him against the solar's cold, and said nothing for a long while after. Sir Alliser Thorne, present at Mormont's own summons, was rather less patient. "Fables," Thorne said. "Men falling from the sky, lightning made flesh. It's exactly the sort of nonsense a green boy king desperate to distract his bannermen from a losing war would put about." "Tywin Lannister does not distract easily," Mormont said, not looking up. "And Tywin Lannister does not agree to truces for boy king's fables." He set the letter down and looked, instead, at the map on his wall, the wall itself, and the haunted forest beyond it, and the long empty white space past that where no maester in living memory had drawn anything but guesses. "We've had rangers gone missing north of the Fist for 2 turns of the moon now. Benjen Stark himself hasn't sent word in longer than that. I've told myself it's wildlings, or the cold, or simple bad luck." His jaw tightened beneath the gray beard. "I no longer believe that's all it is." "So what would you have us do, my lord? Ride south and beg 2 sorcerers for aid against shadows?" "I'd have us do our duty," Mormont said, sharp enough to end the argument, "which is to watch, and to know, before anything crosses that wall that we're not prepared for." He looked to Jon. "Snow, you're friendly with the wildling girl your uncle brought in. Ygritte, is it? I want everything she knows about what the free folk are seeing north of the wall, and I want it before the week's out. If something's stirring, the wildlings will have felt it first. They always do." 300 miles south in the Stark Lannister Tully truce camp that had, against all odds and all history, held for nearly 3 weeks now, Vegeta stood on the crest of a low hill in the pre-dawn dark, alone, having slipped past the sentries without effort or particular concern for whether they noticed. He'd taken to doing this most nights, standing apart, facing north, letting whatever sense he'd developed across 100 worlds of violence tell him what it could about the thing waiting beyond a wall of ice he had not yet seen with his own eyes. Tonight it told him something new, not stronger. The presence hadn't grown, not exactly, but aware. For the first time since they'd landed, Vegeta had the distinct, unwelcome sensation of being looked at in return. Goku found him there an hour later, having woken from a dead sleep with the specific instinct that told him, across 100 battles and 100 worlds, when Vegeta needed backup whether he'd admit it or not. "It noticed you," Goku said. "Not a question. It's noticed us," Vegeta corrected. "It's been aware of our presence since the day we landed, I think. I simply mistook awareness for background noise, the way you mistake half of everything for background noise. Tonight it stopped being background." His eyes didn't leave the northern horizon. "Something out there is old enough, and patient enough, and intelligent enough to wait 3 weeks before deciding whether we're worth its attention. That is not the profile of a mindless horror out of a peasant's fireside tale, Kakarot. That is the profile of a general assessing an enemy. You think it's building toward something. I think," Vegeta said slowly, "that whatever war these Westerosi fight each other over, that iron chair of theirs, is going to look like a schoolyard scuffle compared to what's coming. And I think it has been building toward this for a very great deal longer than either of us has been on this world to notice." He finally turned, and there was something in his expression Goku had seen perhaps a dozen times across all the years he'd known him. Not fear. Vegeta didn't do fear, but the closest adjacent thing a Saiyan prince permitted himself. Genuine, focused respect for an opponent he hadn't yet fully measured. "Then we go look," Goku said simply. "Before it decides to come to us instead." Obviously, Vegeta's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Though I doubt the Boy King and the Lion's father will surrender their new pet monsters so easily. We're rather valuable to them now, I imagine. A truce built on the strength of us being present to enforce it." He wasn't wrong. When Goku and Vegeta raised the idea the next morning, traveling north, past the truce camp, past the neck, all the way to this wall everyone spoke of with such carefully controlled dread, the reaction split cleanly down the lines of everyone's competing interests. Tywin Lannister, informed by Raven, argued through Tyrion that the truce's entire foundation rested on the two of them remaining available and accounted for. A monster loose and unsupervised in the north was, in his calculation, worse than a monster contained where he could watch it. Robb Stark, for his part, saw an opportunity. If the two strangers meant to go north regardless, better they go escorted by Stark men, with Stark eyes reporting back what they found, than let the discovery belong entirely to House Lannister's intelligence network. Catelyn Stark, characteristically, saw the human cost neither man was weighing. "You'd send them into the true unknown," she said to her son, in the privacy of the command tent, on the strength of a feeling one of them describes. "What if you're wrong? What if this is exactly the kind of overreach that gets men killed for nothing?" "Then I've lost nothing I had a claim to in the first place," Robb said. "They're not my men, Mother. They came to us. If they mean to go regardless, and I believe they do, I'd rather have a Stark banner riding with them than let this become a secret the Lannisters own alone." It was, in the end, Goku who settled the argument, the way he so often did. Not through cunning or leverage, but by simply stating, mildly, what he intended to do regardless of anyone's permission. "We're going," he told the assembled council, Robb and Catelyn and Sir Brynden and, present by Raven-relayed argument, Tywin's voice carried through Tyrion. "You can send people with us if you want company, or you can not, but either way we're gonna go find out what's up there before it decides to come find us instead. Vegeta's pretty sure that's not gonna go well for anybody if it happens on its own terms instead of ours." And so, 8 days later, a party left the truce camp riding north. Robb Stark himself, unwilling to send others into the unknown, while he stayed safe behind a truce line. Sir Brynden Tully, too stubborn and too experienced to be left behind. A contingent of 20 northern riders. And, by Tywin's insistence, a single Lannister observer whose only qualification, as far as anyone could tell, was an unshakable loyalty to reporting back everything he saw. Wendell Mudd rode with them too, having attached himself so thoroughly to the story by now that nobody had the heart, or frankly the authority, to send him home. Ahead of them all, unhurried, sometimes walking, sometimes simply flying 100 feet up to scout the country ahead and drifting back down to report nothing more alarming than deer and wolves, Goku and Vegeta led the way north, toward the neck, toward Winterfell, toward a wall of ice 800 feet high that had stood 8,000 years against exactly the kind of thing that had, at long last, begun paying attention back. Behind them the truce held, brittle and strange and entirely unprecedented in the long, bloody history of the Seven Kingdoms. A war of 5 kings paused, however briefly, because for the first time in living memory, every great house south of the wall had looked north together and felt, in their bones, the same cold certainty. Something older than all of them was waking up, and it had noticed that the world had changed. The road north changed character somewhere past the neck, and Wendell Mudd, who had never in his life traveled further than a 2-day ride from the Red Fork, felt it happen the way you'd feel a fever break, except backward. The land didn't warm, it just grew quieter, the bird song thinning out mile by mile until there was nothing left but wind through black pine, and the crunch of hooves on frost that shouldn't have settled this early in the season. Robb Stark noticed it too, though he said nothing of it for the first several days, riding at the head of the column with Grey Wind ranging ahead and behind in restless loops, hackles never quite settling flat. He'd made this ride south, once, as a boy trailing his father to King's Landing, and remembered the north as cold but familiar, his own country, his own bones. This felt different. This felt like riding into something that was watching them arrive. Goku and Vegeta flew ahead most days, scouting, and came back each evening with less to report than either of them liked. "Empty," Vegeta said, on the fifth night, dropping down beside the fire with the particular restlessness of a warrior denied a target. Villages abandoned, not burned, not raided, simply empty, as though everyone in them decided at once to be somewhere else. "Wildling villages," Sir Brendan said grimly, warming his hands. "The free folk live north and west of here, past the wall proper in the haunted forest. If their villages are emptying out this far south of it, then something's pushed them," Robb finished. "Or something's coming, and they know it before we do." They reached Winterfell 12 days after leaving the truce camp, and Robb's youngest siblings, Bran, wheeled out to greet him by Hodor, and Rickon, small and fierce and clinging to his brother's leg the moment he dismounted, gave the whole grim column a night's reprieve from the cold weight of what they were riding toward. But even that reprieve was brief. Maester Luwin had letters waiting, grimmer than anything Robb had received south. 2 more ranging parties from the Night's Watch unaccounted for. Wildling refugees trickling south past even the Wall's own patrols, in numbers nobody could account for. And, worst of all, delivered in Luwin's careful, measured hand that could not entirely disguise his own alarm, a raven from Castle Black itself, 3 days old, requesting urgently that House Stark send word of anything, regarding the strangers rumored to have fallen from the sky, because Lord Commander Mormont wished to know before he committed the Watch's dwindling strength to any course of action. "They're afraid," Bran said from his chair, with the particular unclouded clarity children sometimes have for things adults talk themselves out of seeing plainly. "The Night's Watch is never afraid. Old Nan says they haven't been afraid in 100 years. "They should be," Vegeta said, and something in his flat certainty silenced the hall more thoroughly than any raised voice could have. "So should the rest of you." Castle Black, when they reached it 8 days later, was not what Wendell Mudd had pictured. He'd imagined from songs and stories a mighty fortress bristling with sworn brothers in glittering black mail. What he found instead was a half-empty ruin of a castle, a garrison a fraction the size its ancient halls had clearly been built to house, men going through drills with the tired discipline of soldiers who no longer entirely believed reinforcements were coming. And behind it all, rising into low gray cloud until its top vanished from sight entirely, the wall itself, 800 feet of ancient ice, older than any house, older than the 7 kingdoms, older, Maester Aemon would tell them later, than written memory itself. Goku looked up at it and let out a low whistle. "That's a big wall." "It's meant to be," said the voice behind them, and they turned to find a young man in black, dark-haired, gray-eyed, sword at his hip, and a direwolf pup grown near to full-size padding at his heel, studying the newcomers with an intensity that made Robb's breath catch before recognition hit. "Jon," Robb said, and for a moment the weight of everything else fell away, and it was simply 2 brothers, one in King's Gray and one in Watch Black, closing the distance in 3 long strides to grip each other's arms. "You came yourself," Jon said, when the moment passed and duty reasserted itself. "I didn't think, Robb, with the war can wait a day longer than it already has." Robb's grip on his brother's shoulder tightened. "Something's wrong up here, Jon. Worse than a war. I need to know what you've seen." What Jon Snow had seen, delivered that night in Mormont's Solar to an audience that now included Goku, Vegeta, Robb, Sir Brendan, and, grudgingly permitted by Mormont after considerable argument, The wildling girl Ygritte, freckled and fierce and entirely unimpressed by southern lords, was worse than any raven had conveyed. Rangers found dead and risen again, blue-eyed and cold to the touch, killing their former brothers with a strength no living man carried. A wildling elder, before he died of wounds no blade should have caused, babbling about a king who walked in ice and commanded the dead like a lord commands his household. And beyond the fist of the first men, where Benjen Stark's ranging party had vanished 8 turns of the moon passed without a trace, something Jon himself had felt once, on a night ranging he still wouldn't speak of in full detail. A presence, vast and patient and utterly without warmth, that had looked back at him across half a mile of frozen dark and made him understand, in his bones, precisely how small he was. "The others," Maester Aemon said quietly when Jon finished, breaking a silence that had stretched a full minute. "I did not think I would live to hear that word spoken as fact, rather than a bedtime tale to frighten children. I confess I had hoped never to." Vegeta, who had said nothing through the entire recounting, finally spoke, and every eye in the solar turned to him. "That is the thing I've felt," he said. "The presence your ranger describes. Vast, patient, watching. It is the same thing I have sensed every night since we landed in your Riverlands, growing more aware of us with each week that passes." His jaw tightened. "I did not understand, until tonight, that it commands an army of the dead. That changes my assessment considerably." "Changes it how?" Mormont asked, voice gravel rough with a lifetime of command, and, for the first time in that command, genuine dread. "An army of corpses is not merely dangerous for its numbers," Vegeta said. "It is dangerous because it does not tire, does not fear, and does not stop growing so long as there are bodies left to raise. Every man your watch loses in a skirmish becomes another soldier in the enemy's ranks, unless the body is destroyed entirely. That is not a war of attrition your side can win by simple numbers, Lord Commander. That is a war that only ends one of 2 ways. The thing commanding them is destroyed, or everyone south of this wall eventually joins its army whether they intend to or not." The solar went very quiet. Even Ygritte, who had spent the whole council with the particular sullen defiance of someone forced into a room full of southern lords, found nothing sharp to say in response. "Then we go and destroy it," Goku said, into the silence, with the simple, terrible clarity of a man who had faced exactly this shape of problem more times than he could easily count. "That's the actual solution here, right? Not walls, not armies, not waiting for it to come to us. Somebody goes and ends the thing at the source before it grows any bigger." "You make it sound simple," Sir Brynden said. "It's not simple. It's just clear." Goku's grin, when it came, held none of its usual easy warmth, something harder underneath it. The look of a man settling into the shape of a fight he'd been waiting his whole life, across 100 worlds, to find. "I don't know exactly what we're dealing with yet, but I know Vegeta's felt something old and strong enough that he's actually taking it seriously, and that alone tells me this is worth going to look at properly instead of waiting behind a wall for it to decide when the fight starts." Mormont studied the two of them a long moment, the strangeness of trusting a war's outcome to men he'd known a matter of hours, weighed against 40 years of watching this watch dwindle toward irrelevance against a threat almost nobody south of the wall still believed in. "The watch doesn't have the strength left to mount a true ranging in force," he said finally. "Not one that could reach the source of this, whatever it proves to be, and return to tell of it. If you mean to go north past the wall and find this King of Ice yourselves, I'll not pretend I can stop you, nor that I have any right to ask it of you. But I'd ask this instead. Take rangers who know the land. Take my nephew." A nod toward Jon, whose jaw set with a mixture of dread and fierce, immediate resolve. "And whatever numbers you judge useful. If this ends today in ice and silence with no word ever reaching this castle, I would at least have it end with men who understand what they're looking at, rather than strangers alone in a world not their own." Vegeta's mouth curved, not quite warmly, but with the particular respect of one commander recognizing another's calculus. "A pragmatic offer, Lord Commander. I accept it. Kakarot and I do not need an army at our backs to win this. If it comes to true battle, additional swords would only be additional bodies for the enemy to raise against us later. But I'll not refuse eyes that know this country, and reasons don't need to be mine alone to be sound ones." They rode out 3 days later, at first light, through the great gate beneath the wall, a party smaller than Sir Brynden liked, and larger than Vegeta thought strictly necessary. Jon Snow, Ygritte serving as guide through country she knew better than any southern ranger, a dozen of the Watch's most seasoned men, Robb himself refusing every argument that a king's place was safely behind the wall rather than beyond it. And, walking easily ahead of them all into a haunted forest that had swallowed better men than any of them without a trace, Goku and Vegeta, unhurried, unafraid, watching the tree line with the particular attentiveness of warriors who had learned, across 100 worlds, exactly what it felt like in the moment before a fight that mattered finally arrived. The forest beyond the wall was silent in a way that pressed on the chest, snow muffling every sound but breath and the creak of leather, the black pines standing close and ancient and entirely indifferent to the 7 small figures moving through them. Twice in the first day, Ygritte called a halt at signs the Southerners would have walked straight past, broken branches at an unnatural height, snow disturbed in patterns no animal made. By the second night, even Robb Stark, raised on stories of this forest since infancy, found himself sleeping with his sword bared across his lap, and Grey Wind pressed close against his side, hackles never fully settling. It was on the 3rd night, at a camp pitched in the lee of an ancient weirwood whose carved red face seemed, in the flickering firelight, to watch them with an attention Jon Snow found he couldn't quite dismiss, that Vegeta finally stood, without warning, and turned north with an expression none of them had seen on him before. "It's close," he said, "closer than it's been. It knows we're coming, and it's stopped waiting to see what we intend." Goku rose beside him, the easy warmth gone entirely from his face now, replaced by something focused and ready that made even Jon Snow, who had faced dead men rise and kill his brothers with his own eyes, feel, for one unguarded moment, something close to relief that these two, at least, were on their side of whatever was about to happen. "How close?" Robb asked, hand already on his sword. Vegeta's eyes didn't leave the dark tree line where the snow had begun, very quietly, to fall in patterns that had nothing to do with wind. "Close enough," he said, "that I suggest everyone without our particular advantages stay very near the fire, and very ready to run." The temperature dropped, all at once, hard enough that every breath in the clearing became visible in the firelight, and somewhere beyond the tree line, faint at first and then unmistakable, came a sound none of them had ever heard before, high and cold and utterly without mercy, like wind through broken glass, like the sound ice makes as it splits a lake in deep winter, and underneath it, closer, the soft crunch of footsteps that made no other sound at all. The first of them stepped from the trees a heartbeat later, and Wendell Mudd, pressed low against a fallen log at the edge of the firelight, having attached himself so relentlessly to this story that nobody had thought to leave him behind, understood in that instant why grown men, hardened rangers, spoke of the others only in whispers even when they didn't believe. It was tall, taller than any man, built of something that looked like flesh remembered rather than flesh living, pale, faintly luminous, moving with a fluid, wrongness that no human body should have possessed. Its eyes were the blue of a winter sky at the coldest hour of dawn, and where it walked, the snow itself seemed to still, as though even the storm held its breath. Behind it, more shapes resolved out of the dark. A dozen, then 2 dozen, a silent host of things that had once, Jon Snow realized with a lurch of horror he couldn't fully suppress, been men, rangers, wildlings, the dead reclaimed and remade, standing now with the same terrible blue-eyed stillness as their masters. Whites, John breathed, sword already in hand, though his voice shook with an honesty none of them blamed him for. Robb, fire. We need fire. Steel doesn't. Steel isn't going to matter here, Vegeta said, and stepped forward, past the fire, past the ring of terrified, resolute Watch Brothers, alone, into the space between the living and whatever these things truly were. His voice, when it came again, carried none of the contempt he usually wore like armor, only the flat, focused clarity of a warrior who had, at long last, found an opponent worth the name. "You've been watching us for weeks," he said, to the tall, pale thing at the head of the host, the one whose eyes held something that might, in a human, have been called intelligence. "Deciding whether we were worth your attention, I'll save you the trouble of deciding twice." The White Walker, for that was what it was, John understood now, watching an ice-blue blade coalesce in its hand from nothing at all, forming like frost crystallizing on glass, tilted its head at Vegeta with an expression that was almost horribly curious. It said nothing. It had no need to. It simply raised one hand, and the host of whites behind it surged forward as one, silent and fast and utterly without fear, straight toward the fire and the 7 mortal souls behind it. "Kakarot," Vegeta said, "the dead ones are yours. I want the one at the front. Copy that." Goku moved before the whites had covered half the distance. Not a blur, not quite, but something the human eye could barely track. A shape that simply arrived at the front of the charging host and put a white through a tree with a single open-palmed strike that shattered the corpse into inert, unmoving fragments of frozen flesh and bone. He didn't stop moving. Where a lesser fighter would have needed a breath between strikes, Goku waded into the host like a man clearing brush, each blow ending a white permanently rather than merely knocking it down. Because he'd understood instantly, the way he always understood a fight's true shape within the first exchange, that these things didn't stay down from anything less than complete destruction. Robb Stark, sword drawn, put himself between the fighting and his brother and found, to his own startled relief, that he barely needed to. A white broke past Goku's line and came at him fast and silent, and Robb's blade took its head clean off on pure trained instinct, watching with grim satisfaction as the body finally, truly stopped. "Fire," Sir Brynden bellowed, dragging a burning branch from the campfire and driving it into the chest of a white that clawed at one of the Watch Brothers, and the corpse went up in cold blue flame that seemed, for a moment, to fight the fire itself, before finally, reluctantly, dying. "Steel takes the head. Fire finishes the job. Don't let them close. Don't let them." Vegeta, meanwhile, had eyes only for the White Walker at the center of the chaos, and the White Walker had eyes only for him. It moved to meet him with a speed that would have killed any Westerosi swordsman in the first exchange, the ice blade a blur, aimed with lethal, ancient precision at Vegeta's throat. Vegeta caught the blade between 2 fingers. The sound it made shattering was like a bell cracking, high and clear and final, and for the first time since any record of the others had existed, one of them took a single, visible step backward, not fear, not exactly, but a recalculation, ancient and cold, and entirely without precedent in its long, patient existence. "You're strong," Vegeta said, almost conversationally, flexing the fingers that had just destroyed a weapon 8,000 years in the making. "Stronger than anything walking on 2 legs in this realm has any right to be. I'll grant you that much respect before I end you." His aura kindled around him, blue, white, and building, cracking the frozen ground in a widening circle. But strength alone was never going to be enough. Not against me. The walker raised both hands, and the temperature dropped again, sharply, the very air crystallizing into a blizzard that hadn't existed a heartbeat before. wind screaming through the clearing hard enough to douse half the campfire and send Jon Snow and Ygritte staggering for cover behind the ancient weirwood's broad trunk. It was, Jon understood dimly through the roaring cold, a killing storm, the kind that had, in the deep history the Maesters barely dared record, buried entire ranging parties without a trace. Vegeta didn't so much as flinch. He walked into it, aura flaring brighter, hair beginning to lift and pale from black toward gold, and the storm that should have frozen a mortal man solid within seconds simply broke around him, deflected by heat and force it had never once had to reckon with in 8,000 years of walking this world unchallenged. "My turn," Vegeta said, and closed the distance in a single step that cratered the frozen ground beneath him, driving a fist into the walker's chest with force enough to shatter stone. The White Walker didn't shatter like ice. It didn't fall like a man. It simply came apart, all at once, into 1,000 shards of frost that hung suspended in the sudden stillness for one impossible heartbeat before scattering on a wind that had, just as suddenly, gone calm. The whites behind it, dozens of them still locked in combat with Goku and the desperate, fire-wielding Watch Brothers, collapsed in the same instant, puppets with their strings cut, falling still and silent, and finally, truly dead, all at once, the moment their master ceased to exist. The clearing went quiet. Snow drifted down, ordinary and gentle now, settling over fallen whites and scorched earth, and the wide-eyed, breathless faces of men who had just watched something out of nightmare and legend both die in front of them. Goku let out a long breath, lowering his stance, the fight gone out of the air as quickly as it had arrived. "Huh," he said, into the stillness, with the particular anticlimactic honesty that had carried him through 100 worlds worth of endings. "That was faster than I figured." "That was one," Vegeta said, and something in his voice killed whatever relief had begun to settle over the clearing before it could fully take root. He was looking north still, past the ruined clearing, past the tree line, toward something none of the rest of them could sense. "There is a king who commands these things, Kakarot. We destroyed a lieutenant, nothing more." His fists unclenched slowly, the gold fading back to black in his hair, the fight's aftermath settling into cold, hard calculation. Wherever he is, he felt that. He'll know now, precisely, what we're capable of, and he will either come for us himself, or he will retreat somewhere we cannot easily follow, and rebuild for a war he no longer intends to lose. Jon Snow, pulling himself upright against the weirwood's trunk with hands still shaking from cold and adrenaline both, looked out over a clearing littered with truly, finally dead men he'd once called brothers, and felt something settle in his chest that he suspected would never fully leave him again. Not fear, exactly, though there was plenty of that too. Something closer to understanding. The stories were real, the threat was real, and for the first time in the Watch's long, fading history, they had allies capable of meeting it. "Then we go find him," Robb said, quiet, resolute, sheathing a sword slicked with corpse frost. "Before he rebuilds, before he decides the terms of the next fight instead of us." Vegeta's eyes, when they finally left the northern dark, held something that might, on another face, have been called grim satisfaction. "Now you're finally asking the right question, Boy King," he said. "Get your watch back to the wall. Warn every house south of here what's actually coming. Kakarot and I will scout what's left of this king's forces before he has time to hide them properly." He glanced at Goku, and something passed between them. Old, wordless, the understanding of two warriors who had fought 1,000 battles together and needed no further discussion of what came next. "Round 2, Goku said, grinning again at last, though it carried a harder edge now than it had in the Riverlands wheat field a month and a lifetime ago. "Let's go find him." They walked north into the trees together, unhurried, unafraid, leaving behind them a clearing full of survivors who would carry word south of what they'd seen, and a war of 5 kings that would never again be fought quite the same way, now that every house in it understood, at last, what had truly been waiting in the dark all along. Word of the clearing beyond the wall reached every corner of the 7 kingdoms before the season turned, carried by ravens, by rangers, by a boy king's own testimony delivered in person to a court in King's Landing that received it with considerably more fear than skepticism. Once Tywin Lannister himself stood before the Iron Throne and confirmed, flatly, that he had seen it. The War of 5 Kings did not end that winter. Old grudges and older claims don't dissolve simply because a larger horror reveals itself. Men are stubborn, and pride outlives good sense more often than either. But it changed shape. Alliances that would once have been unthinkable became merely difficult. Banners that had marched against each other for a crown began, slowly and with considerable resentment, to march instead toward a wall that had stood forgotten for too long. Jon Snow returned to Castle Black a different man than he'd left it, not because he'd fought and lived, though that mattered too, but because he understood now, with the particular clarity of a witness rather than a believer, exactly what his watch had always been meant to guard against. He would spend the rest of that winter preparing the wall for a war none of his brothers had truly believed was coming, and he would do it with the strange, steadying knowledge that somewhere beyond it, 2 warriors who owed this world nothing had chosen, of their own free will, to keep fighting for it anyway. Goku and Vegeta did not return south. They pressed further north instead, into country no map had ever charted, hunting a king of ice who had, for the first time in 8,000 patient years, learned what it meant to be afraid of something he could not simply wait out. Whether they found him, and what became of that final reckoning, is a story the small folk of the 7 kingdoms would tell for generations after, half history, half legend, the details shifting a little more with every retelling, the way all the truest stories eventually do. But this much stayed constant, in every version anyone ever told, that a war meant to end in a crown for one house instead became a war fought, for one strange and unrepeatable season, for the whole world at once, and that when the true dark finally came calling on Westeros, it found the realm was not alone in facing it.